first of all, I'm very sorry. Always when a colleague dies, I mean, she's a journalist, a colleague, and it's always very, very sad to see someone dying doing his duty. But one thing is, I mean, unfortunate in this story is that immediately, I mean, on the other side of the border, we know already that Israel did it. I mean, it's true, and not only, and it's not an accident. I mean, it's on purpose. It's an assassination. It's a crime, and it reveals the face of Israel. And unfortunately, also very, very soon, I mean, when it happened, like at 7:15 in the morning, when we woke up with this sad news. So, of course, on the Israeli side, we're the spokesman of the Israeli army saying that, of course, there is a bigger chance that she was shot by the Palestinian side, yet there might be a chance that it came from Israel, and let's check. But on the other side, you see immediately, I mean, that we know already who did it, and Israel did it on purpose. Now, we have to remind you, you know, unfortunately, in 2022, 26 journalists already died during doing their work. 7 in Ukraine, by the way.
Ukraine,
meaning, but why do I say that? Because I looked immediately, you know, at sites of the world. You know, I looked at sites of French newspapers, all over the world, and immediately it was headlines and immediately the news. Meaning, here we take this very, very tragic tragedy. It's a tragic story, of course, and we use it, of course, for political means. We've been in this story before, and we'll see it probably again. And this is how Israel has to cope with it. And I would say again, I mean, I tweeted yesterday when it happened, about an hour after, who needs to check, who needs an inquiry? Because for the world, I mean, that's it. Israel is guilty again without even checking. And let me remind you again, Adura in 2000, if you remember.
Yeah, Mohammed Al-Dura, of course, the trial to his kill.
Israel made the mistake at the time, saying we did it. Afterwards, checking, it wasn't even Israel. I mean, it was proven that it's not even Israel. There was a check, there was a trial in France. You remember France 2, Charles Anderlin, the photographer. But this time, Israel took another reaction, and I think it was very good.
All right, well, let me ask Peter, because you've dealt, of course, with these situations in your time as the IDF spokesperson for the foreign media, your reaction, your assessment of the situation and how Israel's reacting to it.
Good evening, Calev. Shalom, Boaz.
Good evening.
I would say that what we have seen from the outset is actually the entire Israeli institutions were mobilized in order to respond to the situation. You see, on the ground, you have a operational incident which is developing, but in a parallel universe in the media, you have this whole crisis which has developed again, and it is, of course, unfortunate. What we know, we saw Prime Minister Bennett make a statement. We saw the Foreign Minister make a statement. We saw the IDF spokesperson, and as you brought in your story, the IDF Chief of Staff. And what we actually saw is that, and I also think it was actually reflected throughout the media, that there are two issues going on here. And most of the global media actually pointed out that she was killed in an incident during a military operation, an Israeli military operation in Jenin. And then when you go into the stories themselves, the developments of one side saying Israel, the IDF shot her, and on the other side saying, wait, we don't know, we have to check this. So I think the Israeli story over the last 24 hours actually was reflected in most of the media coverage. It doesn't change the fact the situation is a bad situation. The underlining or the fundamental reality, of course, that most of the Western world perceive the situation on the ground as occupation, as a military occupation. And therefore, everything falls into that narrative or that frame of media coverage.
Right, and Peter raises the point, kind of like building on what you said, that in that narrative frame, those who accept that narrative frame are going to fit it within that one, and those who might have a different view or more open are going to have take a more ambiguous stance.
Yeah, but that's a tragic point here. I mean, for the last 2 months, ever since 23rd of March, we had several terrorist attacks in Israel. 19 people died in those 2 months terrorist attacks, okay? 3 of those attacks, including the one in Bnei Brak, for example, the terrorists came from Jenin or the suburbs of Jenin, meaning why is Israel operating there? It's not because Israel wakes up in the morning and says, oh, we're very bored today, we don't know what to do, so let's go to Jenin and have some fun. No, for 2 months, there are attacks in several cities of Israel. Again, I recall 19 people died. I did not see a severe condemnation of those deaths in Israel, and this time it was on purpose. I mean, they come from Jenin in order to kill Israelis or to kill even Jews. I mean, that's why they come.
Well, I should say Mahmoud Abbas did condemn a couple of those killings.
You know what? Yes, but his condemnation, was very, how would I say, I would expect a more serious condemnation, and especially another condemnation that participates in the lies of Temple Mount, saying that Israel is not respecting Muslims over there, etc., which is the biggest lie ever. Right. But in order to be precise, Israel does not go and look for neither kids, neither women, of course not journalists, in order to shoot on them or assassinate them, because look at the mess we are.
Boaz, I want to give you a chance to finish the point you were
making. Only saying, again, it's a tragedy, so sorry it happened, of course, I mean, Yet, we have to remember one thing. First of all, when Israel proposes the Palestinians to check together, I mean, why refuse? Why refuse? I mean, in this situation, first. Second thing, I mean, why knowing, I mean, for sure that it's Israel, and moreover, that Israel did on purpose, like an assassination, and everybody knows that this is not the way Israel functions. I would even say one thing that is really, and I remember Lebanon war. Unfortunately, it also happened that Israeli soldiers killed Israeli soldiers during war, because this is war, this is confrontation. It's not something, I mean, that you go there with confrontation. Fire. So again, friendly fire. So here, let's check, let's see. I would like also to know who's responsible, but don't jump on conclusions as the Palestinians do, because don't make out of this tragedy and out of this great journalist. She was a very good journalist from what I hear. So let's not use her for political reasons, but unfortunately, this is what is being done right now.
Right. Now, in response to the Palestinian charges and a flood of negative press coverage abroad, the Israel Defense Forces is trying to get its message out in response to the shooting of Shireen Abu Akleh. Here's part of a video released today featuring the current IDF International Media spokesperson, Lieutenant Colonel Amnon Scheffler.
During the intense firefight, the journalist Shireen Abu Akleh was killed. The IDF is thoroughly examining this event. As of now, the Palestinians refused Israel's offer for a joint investigation. Her death is a tragedy. I'd like to express my condolences to Abu Akleh's family and colleagues. The Israel Defense Forces will never deliberately target non-combatants. We are committed to the freedom of the press and the sanctity of human life.
Peter, of course, this is going to be a continuing story. We know, as we said, the Palestinians have refused to cooperate with the probe. Presumably, they're going to come out with their own conclusions, which I don't think will be surprising. What advice might you have, for example, to your successor there in that role, as he's going to have to deal with this in the really weeks and maybe months to come?
So, first of all, my advice to Lieutenant Colonel Scheffler, I give him directly, of course. We are colleagues, and I think over the last 24 hours they've been doing a good job of getting the message out. Perhaps it would have been better if he would have done perhaps more interviews, but I think the Israeli message was reflected. To roll back on your opening comment just now, I actually think that the news cycle is moving on. You say today in Finland joining NATO, and in the UK there's a threat of a salmonella breakout. So I think the news cycle has actually moved on. This is an incident with a limited scope and several peaks along the way. And indeed, the funeral today received some more attention. And when the after-action review, whether it's the probe, the Palestinian probe, or the IDF, then it will receive some more attention again. Whether the IDF is able to come to a clear-cut conclusion of who actually conducted this fire, we still don't know. So I would say first of all, you have to be prepared for the outcome. The developments of the reality of the after-action review of the incident itself need to be clear to everybody, and I think the military and the state of Israel need to be forthcoming and present their case. As Colonel Scheffler pointed out, Israel does not intentionally target non-combatants. I think that message was clear. And of course, there will always be those detractors that will say, no, that's not true. But the facts prove otherwise. There have been hundreds and hundreds of military operations just over the last 2 months because of this wave of terrorism that Israel is experiencing. And this incident, it's an unfortunate tragedy. But it's the exception of the rule that actually proves the rule. The IDF is controlled and specific and goes in to conduct specific operations. They don't go just to Jenin just because they want to. They go to conduct specific operations to prevent terrorist attacks against Israel.
Boaz, and there is a point. We're not seeing, simply because Israel is not the media story perhaps it once was, especially in the current news cycle with Ukraine, etc. But there is a kind of drip, drip, drip effect. And incidents like this could certainly, Al Jazeera, we know its position to Israel, even though it does operate freely here. But in the international media, when a journalist is killed, there is a tendency, and you know this as a reporter, to rally around that colleague and demand to see some kind of justice done for that death, whether there any real kind of justice can be delivered.
Because it's a journalist.
Yes.
How many journalists died this year in Mexico? People don't even know. People don't even know. Seven. People don't even care. So, meaning this, not because it's a journalist, because it's a Palestinian, and it reflects, and it's huge for those people, who always want to deny the right of Israel to exist, or our right on Jerusalem, or on Temple Mount, as this is another excuse. Yet, of course, I'm very sad that this journalist has died. I'm very sorry, as I said, when a colleague dies. I heard that she was a great journalist, and I'm so sad. Of course, me as an Israeli, as a Jew, of course, and I mean it. Again, our army never targets non-combatants, never. This is something, I was in the army, I know. When you join the Israeli army, people have to understand, you see all the rules, that you don't even want to take the gun because you say to yourself, my God, it's either my life or I go to a judge or to a trial. So I know to which army we have. Yet, I'll have maybe one little remark or little criticism. We saw the Israeli officer from the Spokes Army. Nowadays, with what's happening now, I would have preferred that. I might be wrong. I'm not a professional of a spokesman. We have Mr. Lerner, who knows much better than me. But maybe someone without uniform would be better. The message would go better, non-uniform, in 2022, because the world is changing, and I think that this is for the period to come. For our period.
Let me ask Peter about that. Is that a point that maybe we shouldn't be the main spokespeople for Israel in this case shouldn't be uniformed officers?
So we've had this debate frequently over the last years, probably over the last 10, 15 years. I think I've even spoken with Boaz about it in the past. Of course, it is a dilemma, but at the end of the day, the military needs to be accountable for what it does. And does the military spokesperson need to be in uniform or need to be in a civilian uniform or in civilian attire? Or on the other hand, maybe the best spokesperson for this would be somebody from the foreign ministry or from the defense ministry and somebody from the civilian echelon. That is a valid question, and we've grappled with it in the past. The reality in Israel is the military is so prominent in the public discourse that there was a need for a military spokesperson. I would say the amount of times the military needs to be in uniform on television should be probably 1/3 of all of the civilians. So there needs to be a reflection of military activities on the one hand by military people, but there needs to be a much more vast coverage of the civilian spokesperson. And we have talented spokespeople, people that know their job, people who represent the state of Israel and can get the information from the military. So I would say yes and no. There needs to be a good mixture of the two.
All right. Well, Peter Lerner, I'm going to ask you to stay with us. Boaz Bismuth, we have to let you go. Thank you for joining us.